Hey everybody, Gary with Basecamp Trading. Let's take a look at the ES futures today because that was a really interesting market to trade. The ES in the overnight was making higher highs, higher lows, and then you had the vaccine news release that just sent prices ripping to the upside. This was actually pre-market, but giant rip to the upside. But then we had kind of a red flag flagging here. This was a reversal doji at all-time new highs. So we left this big topping tail, reversal doji, shooting star, whatever you want to call that. And then the next bar triggered that to the downside, left the topping tail. The entire body of this bar was all selling, followed up by yet another really bearish bar, a little topping tail. The entire body of that bar was all selling. Found support right here at the 13 EMA. Now this bar actually opened right here at the bottom. It pushed up, left the topping tail, but the body was still buying at that point. This bar opened right here, left a little topping tail, and then it actually pushed down through the 13 EMA, but then bounced off the 21. Left a bottoming tail right there. Next bar opens right here, little push into resistance, pushes back down, then leaves another bottoming tail bouncing off the 21. This bar opens right here, pushes down, leaves a little bottoming tail, but ends up closing back above the 21. Now the body of this bar was all selling, so it's still looking a little bearish. We had kind of a bullish bar right here, bullish dragonfly doji. This bar actually didn't trigger it to the upside. This bar was actually a little more bearish, but then it was followed by a really bullish bar, tiny bottoming tail. Entire body of this bar was all buying, and it closed back above the 5 and the 13 resistance. Now we're in lunchtime now, so not as much price action. However, this was still a fairly bullish bar. The entire body of that bar was all buying as well. It looked like maybe the ES was going to continue its uptrend because at this point we're still making higher high, higher low, higher high, and at this point this still looks like a higher low, and it looks like we're going to push higher. However, and if you were in the trading room this afternoon, you know we were talking about this. We were very hesitant to take a long position because momentum just was not confirming that. Now, the fast and slow line, they're still above the zero line, but they're crossed to the downside. And we'd actually broken underneath the previous pivot low on the fast and the slow line. So it was still above the zero line, but they were crossed to the downside. And that was the red flag also. You know, we had an overall bullish chart because technically this was, at this point here, this was still an overall bullish chart. 5 above 13. Price in moving averages above the 21. Price kept bouncing off the 21. You can see underneath it, closed above it, underneath it, closed above it, underneath it, closed above it, closed above it, bounced off of it, closed above it. So you could see, you know, and at that time, again, you know, we had higher high, higher low, higher high, and at that time, another higher low with an overall bullish chart. 5 above 13, above the 21, 50 above the 200. But momentum was kind of the red flag. Now, technically, we are still above the zero line. The fast and slow line are still above the zero line, which is somewhat bullish. I mean, when we take bullish trades, we want the fast and slow line to be above the zero line. However, this was looking really weak because, one, they were still crossed to the downside. Two, they had broken under the previous pivot low on the momentum lines. And we ended up triggering a bearish inflection instead. What we ended up doing, instead of putting in a higher low and then moving up to a new higher high, we ended up putting in a pivot reversal doji that triggered to the downside, making a lower high. So now we went from higher high, higher low, higher high. This technically was a higher low. However, at this point, this now becomes a pivot. It's not a lower pivot low because our previous pivot low was back here. So it's a pivot. And now we have a lower pivot high. And when we break below this pivot, we now will have a lower pivot lows. We would have a lower pivot high, break underneath here, and now we have a lower pivot low, changing the trend. This is a 30-minute trend reversal breakout underneath this previous pivot at 35.88. And as you can see, we triggered the reversal doji, worked its way down, kind of bounced around the 5 and 13 for a while on this bar, then bounced around it a little bit and came down to the 21, kind of hung out at the 21. We actually pushed back into the 21, and then this bar actually broke back above the 21, and it broke back above the 5 and the 13. However, it left the topping tail, and the entire body was selling. We triggered the trend reversal breakout to the downside, and then the ES just started to rip lower. And you could see at the same time we were triggering a bearish inflection on momentum, confirming our thinking that the fast and slow line still being crossed to the downside was not good for a further push to the upside in the ES. And as it turns out, we ended up breaking lower. And it gave us some pretty decent Renko setups. We were able to trade that on the Renko chart because it gives us some lower risk opportunities. And right in here is where our 30-minute trend reversal breakout was happening. Same thing here. We had a higher pivot high. You can see higher than this previous pivot high. But then we had a pivot. It wasn't a lower pivot low. Our previous pivot low was back here. There's kind of a sloppy pivot area here, but a pivot nonetheless. And then we put in a lower pivot high and then broke to a lower pivot low. And then you got this nice wick off the 34, pull back, another Trender Pro 2.0 wick off the 18 for a nice push to the downside. Pull back into the 34 with a fast line zero touch for a nice push down. And then another wick off the 18 for yet another nice push to the downside. So we had some nice low risk entry opportunities off our Renko chart that was being confirmed by that 30-minute trend reversal breakout, and the ES just ripped to the downside really right on into the close. The close was right in here. This is when the market actually closed. Little bounce in the after hours, but the market was closed at this point. It's just the extended trading session. So that was a bearish move to the downside, and actually is kind of looking a little bearish for the ES altogether. It went up there, possibly ran stops on the daily chart, breaking above previous highs, and went to a new all-time high. But then this was a really bearish close. So some pretty bearish price action, especially in the afternoon in the ES today.